encouraging these people on how to live in that difficult time. Now he's going to change the emphasis and focus on how the shepherds are supposed to shepherd during that time, because there's no opting out of shepherding because of difficult times. In fact, it's more necessary than ever, right? And so that's where he's beginning here in verse 1 of chapter 5, when he says, therefore, that's considering all the context before, everything I taught you, therefore, this is what you need to do, which means the shepherds need to have this message of 1 Peter in mind as they shepherd the flock, so they can know what to encourage the flock to be doing. So he says, therefore, I exhort the elders among you, as your fellow elder and witness of the sufferings of Christ, and partaker also of the glory that is to be revealed. So Peter begins with reestablishing his authority. Now, why do you think he has to reestablish authority? Because now he's speaking to men who think they have authority, right? And men that do have authority, but not the same that he has, right? And so he's speaking to these men, and he's reminding them, since he's going to be challenging them, that they need to listen to what he has to say. So he begins by connecting with them. He says, as your fellow elder, as somebody who's speaking from the experience that you are now going through, right? Shepherding the flock through difficult times. And so he says, I'm an elder just like you are, but he says, and witness of the sufferings of Christ. Now he's drawing on the fact that he actually witnessed the life and the ministry of Christ and the sufferings of Christ. So he's saying, I'm not just an elder, I'm an eyewitness of what Jesus did, and I'm one of the 12, I'm an apostle, so I have greater authority. And then he also talks about, and partaker also of the glory which is to be revealed. Then he reminds them of what they're all working toward together. I'm also partaker of the same promise that we're all working toward together. So that's how he begins in connecting with the elders and encouraging them to listen to what he has to say. But what I want to talk about as we get into this, I want to take a look. We're gonna do a little bit comparing and contrasting, right? Because this is the time of year that we remember the birth of Jesus, right? We got Christmas coming up this week. And so I thought it'd be really great for us to take a look at the Good Shepherd, which is Christ, and how he modeled shepherding his flock and how he called others to lead in the same way. But jumping to verse 2, 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 2, it says, shepherd the flock, it's a command, shepherd the flock of God among you, exercising oversight. So here it says, shepherd the flock among you, which this means that you are in charge of the people that you live among, right? It's your local body. This is specific. It's not talking about shepherding the church as a model of, elders over entire cities or over entire groups like other models have. But this is talking about shepherding the flock that are part of their group. In our context, it'd be our congregation. And there, when he says shepherd, the idea of shepherd is actually most often translated feed. And so it's not just to lead, although it involves leading, maybe leading the sheep to food, but he's telling them to feed your flock. Now notice he's telling that to the shepherds, because the shepherds have the responsibility of equipping the saints for the works of service, right? So that they're not tossed to and fro by the different winds and waves of doctrine. These shepherds are the ones that are supposed to be grounded in the Word of God, probably the most so within the congregation, so that they can keep the congregation grounded and continue to shepherd or feed the flock what they need to grow. And it says exercising oversight. Now, this verse, people often, I've heard elderships use this as the reason that they govern in the way that they do, right? The exercising oversight, they take that and they think of that sets them up as a board of directors, right? Exercising oversight like a board of directors exercises oversight over a corporation. But that's not at all what this means. In fact, when you look at what exercising oversight is actually one word in the Greek, and what it means is to examine closely. Now, if you think about everything that's going on, dealing with members who are struggling and going through different struggles and strife and being persecuted, what he's saying is you need to shepherd the flock, you need to feed the flock, and you need to look and examine the flock closely so that you can shepherd the flock or meet their needs. And so exercising oversight is less about decision-making and more about living among and being involved, closely involved in the lives of the flock. You cannot be a shepherd that is not involved in the lives of your members. And that's what Jesus is getting at in the story of the Good Shepherd in John chapter 10, he's speaking to the Pharisees and the leaders of Israel. These people were viewed and treated themselves as the spiritual elite, far above the common people, right? They knew better. The other people were just ungodly. They looked down upon the common people, and they viewed themselves as these important spiritual leaders who had the job of guiding these incapable people. But Jesus is informing them that they're really not doing the job, and their sheep don't know their voice. And so Jesus says this to say, he says, "But he who enters by the door is a good shepherd of the sheep. To him the doorkeeper opens, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calls his own sheep by name and leads them out. And when he puts forth all his own, he goes ahead of them, and the sheep follow him because they know his voice. A stranger they simply will not follow, but will flee from him, and because they do not know his voice, the voice of strangers." And Jesus says in verse 11, "I am the good shepherd. The good shepherd lays down his life for the sheep." So here, Jesus tells a story about the good shepherd. He says the shepherd is the one whom takes care of the sheep, who leads the sheep. And it says the sheep know his voice. I was talking to Tom Gomer after last service, and he was telling me about somebody he knew who actually cared for sheep. And he said it was true. The lady said that when she got home, the sheep knew her voice, and she would call, and they would all come. But if a stranger, somebody else came and called for her sheep, they wouldn't even respond. And so it's interesting, Jesus is drawing on something that they would have understood, that shepherds know their sheep when the shepherd is involved in the lives of the sheep, right? When the shepherd is personally ministering to the needs of their people, especially their spiritual needs. You cannot be a shepherd who is not actively involved in the lives of your sheep. And that doesn't just mean your inner circle. That means all of the sheep. Working together with the other elders to make sure that the elders as a whole are involved in the lives of all of the sheep so that they know your voice and they will follow where you lead. But he goes on. He says, not under compulsion, but voluntarily. And so here he's saying that those who shepherd the sheep shouldn't do it because they're compelled by some reason to do that. Now, I've heard of some men being compelled to be in leadership by churches that want them to lead, right? Or maybe in a smaller congregation where they don't have many men who meet the base qualifications, but they have some, and they want these men to be elders. And so they are trying to get them to be elders even though they don't really want to do that. And some men give into that pressure and some don't. But here it says you should not be compelled to the role. Now, it's not just outsiders that can compel someone to seek the office of an elder, right? They can be compelled by their own desires, by their sordid gain. We'll get to that in a minute, but they can be compelled by the idea of pride. They can be compelled by their need for control. They can be compelled maybe because they want to take the church another direction and they need to be a part of the leadership or the deciding body, right? There's many different reasons that people can be compelled into the office of a shepherd. But if you are compelled by any of those reasons, then you have no business being a shepherd. He says you're supposed to do it voluntarily. Now, you might think, well, of course people want to volunteer for that role. It's a great honor to be a shepherd. Well, it is a great honor to be a shepherd if you shepherd well, but it's also a great responsibility if you actually understand and are committed to the role. Because the role of a shepherd is not, the primary job of the shepherd is not to be a decision maker. Now, they do make decisions, right? Making decisions is part of how they lead the sheep, but it's not their primary function. It's just a small part of what they're supposed to do. And so volunteering to be a shepherd is not volunteering to be on the board or the committee that makes the decisions. Volunteering to be a shepherd is volunteering to be a servant of the body and volunteering to serve others until your own death, if it requires it, not until you die. I think we can tend to view the office of elder like the Supreme Court, right? You're elected until death. That's also not right. You should being a shepherd is something that you should do as long as you're capable of doing it effectively. If you're no longer capable of shepherding effectively, meaning ministering to the needs of the body, then I think the most honorable thing is to step back. And I think that's what Dick did, right? When his life circumstance changed and he decided that it was no longer right for him to stay on as a decision maker if he couldn't actually be involved in the lives and shepherd the flock because he had more important needs at home. How honorable was it to step down and to say, I'm not in that role anymore. I'm not capable of carrying it out the way it needs to be done, and it's best for the health of the body, like the mindset of a good shepherd, to step back. And so when we think about executing the office or the role or the responsibility of being a shepherd and volunteering, it's volunteering to do one of the hardest tasks in all of the church today. And then in Luke 22, this is Jesus. Jesus is at we'll jump back, and it says, according to the will of God, and not for sordid gain. So when he says according to the will of God, he's not saying that shepherd in the way that God has told you, or God, shoulder tapped you, or decided that you should be a shepherd. But the idea of shepherding according to the will of God is doing it in the way that God desired for it to be done. And that's what he's going to get to in a minute. And he says, according to the will of God and not for sordid gain. So if you have other reasons other than caring for the souls of God's people, if you have other reasons other than glorifying God for stepping into this role of shepherding, if your goal is not to serve the body and be an example of service, then you should not be a shepherd. But he said, not only should you do it voluntarily, not only should you do it for the right reasons, but you should do it eagerly. Means you should be excited about going to serve God's people and to teach God's people. There's a reason why shepherds are required to be able to teach. It's not just so they can say, I can teach when needed. It's so they can actively live a ministry of continually teaching the body. I've heard it said that a congregation is merely a shadow of its leadership. Meaning if you're thinking about the spiritual health of a congregation, and you look at whether it's growing numerically, or whether it's growing spiritually, most important, or if it's declining numerically or declining spiritually, it's simply a symptom of what is going on within the leadership. If you have leadership that is growing and has a deep eagerness to pursue the Word of God and a deep eagerness to serve one another, the people that follow them will do the same. But if you do not have that example being set, if the example is taking a less involved approach, or not being diligent in study, not desiring to teach or to step into those roles, then you're going to have a congregation that reflects that. In Luke 22, this is Jesus with his disciples just before his death. But this is him there preparing for the Last Supper. And he's with his disciples, and he says this, when the hour had come, he reclined at the table, and the apostles with him. And he said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I supper. So he's eagerly desired this meal. I don't think it's because he's looking forward to the taste of the meal. I don't think it's because he's looking forward to calling out one of his disciples for betraying him. I don't think he's looking forward to washing the disciples' feet. I don't think he's looking forward to going out into the garden and praying with sweat drops of blood while his disciples fall asleep. I don't think he's looking forward to being arrested and beaten and charged and then eventually murdered. I don't think that's what he's eager for. What he's eager for is the benefit that will come to his flock for his willingness to die for them. What he's eager for is the spiritual growth that will be provided to his disciples through the teaching that's going to go on at this meal and through the example that Jesus is going to set. What he's eager for is to glorify God. And that's the same eagerness that shepherds are called to have, an eagerness to serve the body for the glory of God. When you get to verse 3, it says, not yet as lording it over those allotted to your charge, but proving to be an example to the flock. And so it's not about the authority. Now, do elders have authority? Yes, they have authority. And we're supposed to subject ourselves to the elders. But their role and responsibility doesn't end at their authority to make decisions. Their their primary responsibility is why they are called shepherds, to care for the spiritual life of those people, God's people, that are put in their charge. And so it's kind of funny, in Luke 22, Jesus is there with his disciples taking this meal together. He's just told them that somebody's going to betray him. They spend one verse 23, talking about who that might be, and then immediately get in an argument about who's the greatest. It's so sad, but it's also not uncommon. Verse 24 says, "And there arose a dispute among them as to which of one of them was regarded to be the greatest." Look at Jesus' rebuke. "And he said to them, the kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who have authority over them are called benefactors, because they benefit from their authority. But it is not this way with you, but the one who is the greatest among you must become like the youngest, and the leader like the servant." That's how Jesus expected leadership to function within the church. It's not supposed to look anything like corporate leadership. It's not supposed to look anything like leadership among the nations or in the government. But the leaders are supposed to be the greatest servants of all, and examples of servitude to those that they volunteered to serve. In verse 3 it says, not as lording over, but they're proving to be an example. Jesus gives them a powerful example in John chapter 13. This is all in that same context of the upper room, where they're having the Passover meal. And Jesus has had this conversation with them about leadership, and they've shared in the meal together. And then after that, Jesus removes his garments, and he goes and he washes the feet of the disciples. Even the one that was there to betray him. Jesus washes their feet. And this is what he says to them. He says, "So when he had washed their feet and taken his garments and reclined at the table again, he said to them, 'Do you know what I have done for you? You call me teacher and Lord, and you are right, for so I am. If I then, the Lord and the teacher, washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I gave you an example that you also should do as I did to you.'" What a beautiful example of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. So when the disciples got in an argument about who's the greatest, Jesus' response was to wash their feet. Now, they all knew that he had the greatest authority in the room. They all knew that he was the Messiah. They knew that he was the teacher and Lord. But they didn't expect him to wash their feet. But Jesus wanted them to understand that that's exactly what he expects of the shepherds, to be those men setting that example. Now, this message is important not just for our current shepherds. It's important for anybody ever thinking about becoming one, to realize it's more than joining the board or the group that makes decisions for the church. That's a very, very small piece. The biggest piece, especially now in the world that we live in, is shepherding the flock, closely examining their lives to know where they're at, knowing where all the sheep are. I mean, this auditorium's not full, and it wasn't full in the last service. And there's going to be, our shepherds will answer for that. I'm not saying they're doing a bad job. Don't hear me saying that. But what I'm saying is if you're pursuing that role, you're volunteering to answer for not just yourself, and if you're a man, not just for your wife and for your kids, but you're answering for the entire flock that is put into your charge. And it is your main responsibility is to make sure that they are spiritually taken care of. And if we live in a time where we can't all assemble all together at one time, which means the burden, the task is much bigger. It looks a lot more like herding cats now than it did before, right? Because they're not all at the same service. And they're not all coming to service. Some of them are watching online. And so the elders have a big responsibility. They need help. They need support. They need encouragement. But they also need to be making sure that they're doing what they're called to do during this time. Because there's no excuses that can be made for not carrying out a task you volunteered for. There's a lot of grace in Scripture, but there's not much offered to leaders who fail to do their job. That's important to understand. There is grace. That requires action. It requires recognition of what needs to be done and what is being done. And when shepherds shepherd the flock according to the will of God, they have a great promise. It says, and when the chief shepherd appears, you'll receive the unfading crown of glory. The crown of glory there is not one of royalty. It's a crown of victory. This life is hard. It's hard for everybody. It's especially hard for shepherds because it's their job to help everybody through it. And that's a tough, tough, tough responsibility. And they need our prayers. And they need our support. They need our love. And so do their wives. Their wives especially, probably, need love and support and care and consideration. And so my encouragement to you as a member is if you do have a need, reach out to your elders. Let them know. Ask them for what you need. Don't sit around and wait for them to call and pass judgment on it on them because they haven't called you. I mean, sure, they should be making the rounds and contacting, but there's also a lot of sheep in this fold. And so instead of passing judgment, reach out. Maybe your shepherd needs encouragement. That's okay too. If you're a shepherd, I encourage you to think carefully about what you've committed to. And I encourage you to continue to do it if you're doing it well, to step up and do it if you're not doing it. If you're not involved in the lives of your members, then you need to step up and get involved. And if you're not willing to, then you probably shouldn't continue with the title that you're going to answer for. If you're thinking of one day becoming an elder, think about what the job actually entails. Don't just think about the title or the power or the decisions, but think about whether or not you're willing to volunteer to take on the struggles of an entire group of people. And you think about whether or not you have the desire to be there for those people. And if you're not a Christian and you're struggling through these times and you want help, think about what a blessing it is to be a part of a body that has shepherds, people who are specifically tasked and specifically volunteered for the purpose of meeting your spiritual needs and bringing you closer into God and discipling you. Because that's what the church is supposed to be. It's what the church is. That's the way God designed it, so that we have shepherds to care for us, so that we can all make it to heaven together. It's a beautiful, beautiful design that God has for us. But it's also a lot of work. And we have to work together. We have to encourage one another. And we have to show grace to one another as we all grow together. So if there's any other way that we can help you this morning, please come as we stand and sing.